Our first reading today is from the prophet Hosea. Hosea is probably my least favorite book in the Bible. The book consists almost entirely of a long, drawn out metaphor of the love of God for the northern kingdom of Israel, using Hosea's own marriage to an unfaithful woman. The use of another person to further Hosea's prophetic goals leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But his point is that while Israel has deserted God and brought suffering and destruction upon itself, God has not and will not desert or forget God's people. God is always faithful and never gives up on any of us. And it is this faithfulness of God, despite the faithlessness of humanity, that is at the heart of the gospel. As with the story of Martha and Mary a few chapters earlier, Jesus is preparing himself to die on the cross in Jerusalem and is trying to preach love for one another and for God in the midst of this preaching. A man from a seemingly wealthier background brings his domestic squabble to Jesus. He and his brother are fighting over an inheritance. That is, a relative, probably their father, has died, and rather than mourning that death and coming together as brothers in their grief, the brothers are being torn apart over the distribution of wealth that each feels owed. And so Jesus turns to a parable regarding a rich man who is blessed by better than expected harvest. The man has more grain than he knows what to do with. But of course, he did not plant it alone, he did not grow it alone, and he did not harvest it alone. And there are no doubt people in his village who do not know whether they will have enough food to survive the winter. But rather than offering his workers some of the grain or giving it to the poor, he instead turns to hoarding his grain. And then he dies. The barn for hoarding his grain is left incomplete, and no one in the end is benefited from this blessing of abundance. And this is the point that Jesus is trying to make to his audience. When we become focused on the accumulation of wealth and personal security, we hurt not just one another, but ourselves as well. We become anxious and stressed that what we have accumulated may be taken away. We lock our doors and set alarms. We buy cameras and we sit and monitor them. We complain about how we never had to worry about thieves in the good old days, and that these kids today have no respect for others. But we forget that in those old days, we did not have anything worth stealing. We may have experienced a thief in our home or car, but they left empty-handed. And it is only because we have accumulated wealth that we are now concerned with it being taken away. And when this accumulation of stuff becomes our addiction, we stop being able to see not only people who have turned to theft, but even those we perceive as potential thieves, as human beings, as the image of God. We start to value objects over people. We worry more about the things that can be replaced than the people who live on the fringes of our society. People fighting addictions, those who struggle to stay employed, single mothers raising their children alone, and those who are not sure where their next meal is coming from. We fall into what Paul rightly calls in our second reading, idolatry. We make the accumulation of stuff more important than one another, more important than the image of God. The young man that asked Jesus the question regarding his inheritance exemplifies this idolatry. He and his brother have allowed their relationship, their fraternal bond, to be broken by a dispute over their inheritance, over wealth that was earned by others, over each's sense of entitlement. And it is this sense of entitlement that causes us to break our bonds to one another, and by extension, with God, that Hosea is railing against in the first reading. We are called to respond to the faithfulness of God by keeping faith with one another, to see all we have as a gift to be shared with those whose needs are going unfulfilled, rather than as our entitlement be hoarded. Amen.